The cake was still warm when Vanessa walked into my kitchen, took one look at the 3-layer chocolate cake my grandchildren and I had spent the entire afternoon building together, flowers still dusting my granddaughter's hair, and said, loudly enough for both children to hear clearly, "God, that looks like garbage. Please tell me you're not actually planning to serve that to people." My 7-year-old granddaughter Lily, who had cracked every single egg into that batter with the fierce concentration only a child can bring to something they consider genuinely important, froze mid-sentence describing to her mother how she'd helped measure the cocoa powder, her small face falling in a way that broke something loose in my chest that I am still, weeks later, trying to fully put back together. My name is Robert, I'm 68 years old, and this chocolate cake recipe belonged first to my own father, a baker by trade who ran a small shop in our town for 30 years before he retired, handed down through 3 generations of men in my family who'd learned, each in turn, that a cake made properly was worth more than any words you could say at a birthday table. It was the cake I made for my son Mark's birthday every single year of his childhood, the cake he requested for his 16th birthday and again for his 30th, the cake that has, for as long as anyone in our family can remember, meant something considerably larger than chocolate and flour and sugar. When Mark married Vanessa 9 years ago, I taught her the recipe myself, standing in this same kitchen, wanting badly for her to feel woven into a tradition rather than standing outside one, and she'd smiled and taken notes and told me, at the time, that she couldn't wait to make it herself someday. She never once did. Lily and her younger brother Noah, 5 years old, had been begging me for weeks to teach them the recipe properly, old enough finally, I'd decided, to handle real ingredients rather than just licking the spoon the way they had as toddlers, and I'd spent that entire Saturday afternoon with them, letting Lily crack eggs with the specific pride of a child doing something adults trust her with, letting Noah stir the batter until his small arm gave out and I finished the rest, both of them arguing sweetly over who got to lick the mixing bowl clean once we poured the batter into the pans. It was, without exaggeration, one of the happiest afternoons I'd spent with my grandchildren in longer than I could easily remember, 3 generations really, since Lily kept asking whether this was the exact recipe her great-great-grandfather had made in his shop, and I told her yes, precisely this one, not a single ingredient changed in over 80 years. Vanessa arrived to pick the children up around 5 that evening, having dropped them off that morning for what she called grandpa time, while she and Mark handled some errands, and I understand now, looking back, that whatever mood she walked into my kitchen carrying had almost certainly started somewhere else entirely, some argument with Mark, some stress from her own demanding job managing a boutique marketing firm, some private frustration that had nothing at all to do with a chocolate cake cooling on my counter. But none of that context excuses what she chose to do with that frustration once she saw 2 small children standing proudly next to something they'd built with their own hands. Garbage was the word she used, specifically, loudly, in front of both children, and I want to be precise about why that particular moment cut as deeply as it did, because it wasn't really about the cake itself, which was, I'll say plainly, a beautifully constructed 3-layer cake I've made successfully more times than I can count. It was about the fact that Lily had spent an entire afternoon believing she was doing something that mattered, something connected to her own history, something worth the flower in her hair and the careful concentration on her small face, and in one careless sentence, her mother had told her, in front of the very grandfather who'd taught her to be proud of it, that the thing she'd built was garbage. I want to tell you I responded perfectly in that moment, with grace and calm wisdom, but the honest truth is I stood there for several long seconds simply stunned, watching Lily's face crumple, watching Noah, too young to fully understand what had just happened but old enough to know something had gone wrong, look uncertainly between his mother and me, and it was Lily herself, finally, who broke the silence, asking in a small, wounded voice whether her cake was actually bad. That question, more than anything Vanessa had said, is what moved me from stunned silence into something clearer and steadier. I knelt down to Lily's level, told her plainly that the cake was wonderful, that she had done a beautiful job, that sometimes grown-ups say unkind things when they're having a hard day that has nothing to do with the person standing in front of them, and that none of what her mother had just said changed how proud I was of her. Vanessa, to her credit, seemed to catch herself somewhere in the middle of my response to Lily, her face shifting from irritation into something closer to embarrassment, and she apologized, quickly, saying she hadn't meant it the way it came out, that she'd had a long day, the kind of hurried apology people offer when they're more concerned with smoothing over the moment than actually reckoning with what they said. I accepted it in front of the children because I didn't want them absorbing any more tension than they already had that evening, but I told Vanessa, once the children were occupied gathering their things by the door, that I needed a private word with her before she left, and something in my tone must have made clear this wasn't a request she could easily brush past. What followed, standing in my own kitchen with the abandoned cake still cooling between us, was a conversation I'd been avoiding having directly for nearly 2 years, ever since I'd started noticing a pattern I'd initially talked myself out of taking seriously. Vanessa had, over that time, gradually reduced the frequency of my visits with the grandchildren, always with reasonable-sounding explanations, schedule conflicts, activities that ran long, soccer practices that suddenly needed to happen on the exact Sunday afternoons I'd always had with them, and I'd accepted each individual explanation because none of them, on their own, seemed unreasonable. But I'd also started noticing smaller things I couldn't quite explain, a birthday card I'd mailed to Lily that she later mentioned she'd never received, a wooden toy box I'd built by hand for Noah's birthday that I never once saw in photos of his room even months later, a photo album I'd carefully assembled of Mark's own childhood that Vanessa had told me she'd put somewhere safe for the kids to look at when they're older, a phrase that had struck me as odd at the time but that I'd let pass without pushing further. Small gifts and gestures that seemed to simply vanish somewhere between my hands and my grandchildren's actual experience of them, each one small enough to explain away individually, each one, I understand now, part of something considerably larger once I finally stopped explaining them away one at a time. I told Vanessa, standing in that kitchen, that I'd noticed these things, that I'd chosen for 2 years to give her the benefit of the doubt on each individual instance because I didn't want to become the kind of father-in-law who manufactures grievances out of ordinary family chaos, but that calling Lily's cake garbage in front of her, on an afternoon that had clearly meant something significant to my granddaughter, had finally made me unwilling to keep explaining away a pattern that, taken together, looked considerably less like ordinary chaos and considerably more like something deliberate. Vanessa's face went through several changes standing there, defensiveness first, the reflexive kind that comes before someone has actually decided whether to be honest, and then, slowly, something that looked more like exhaustion than anger. She told me, finally, more honestly than I expected, that she'd struggled for years with feeling like a genuine outsider in Mark's family, that the traditions, the recipes, the inside jokes stretching back decades before she'd ever arrived, made her feel, more often than she'd ever admitted to Mark directly, like a permanent guest in a family that had already fully formed itself long before she showed up, and that watching her own children get folded so easily and completely into that same tradition, learning the same recipes, absorbing the same history, had stirred something in her she wasn't proud of, a kind of quiet resentment she'd never intended to act on but had, apparently, been acting on in small ways for longer than she wanted to admit even to herself. I sat with that admission for a long moment, because it complicated the anger I'd been carrying into that conversation in a way I hadn't expected, understanding suddenly that Vanessa's cruelty toward a chocolate cake wasn't really about the cake or even entirely about Lily, it was about 9 years of feeling like she was raising her children inside a family history she'd never quite been given full ownership of herself. That understanding didn't excuse what she'd said, and I told her so plainly, that whatever insecurity she was carrying did not entitle her to make a 7-year-old feel ashamed of something she'd built with pride, and that the missing cards and gifts, whether deliberate or simply neglectful, needed to stop immediately and completely. We talked for nearly an hour that evening, longer than any conversation Vanessa and I had managed in 9 years of careful, polite distance, and I told her something I probably should have said years earlier, that the recipe, the traditions, all of it, existed to be shared rather than guarded, that I would have taught her that cake with real joy at any point in the last 9 years if she'd ever once asked, that the family history she felt excluded from had never actually been closed to her, it had simply been waiting for her to walk fully into it rather than standing at the edge of it, resentful and unsure. Mark found out everything 2 days later, once Vanessa, to her genuine credit, decided to tell him herself rather than letting me carry the weight of that conversation alone, and the family dinner that followed was difficult in ways our family hadn't experienced before, Mark torn between defending his wife and understanding, clearly and painfully, what his father and his children had actually experienced. He didn't excuse what Vanessa had done, but he also, wisely I think, didn't turn it into a referendum on their entire marriage, choosing instead to focus on what needed to change practically, more consistent time with the grandchildren, actual transparency about gifts and cards going forward, and, at his own suggestion, a standing invitation for Vanessa to finally learn that cake recipe properly, this time for real. She came over 3 weeks later, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon without the children, and stood in my kitchen while I walked her through every step, the specific way my father always sifted the cocoa powder twice back in his shop, the particular temperature the butter needed to be at, the trick of adding the coffee to deepen the chocolate flavor that his own father had insisted on and that I'd never once written down anywhere. Small details that had nothing really to do with the cake itself and everything to do with finally being let all the way into something she'd spent 9 years watching from just outside its edges. She asked, at one point, almost shyly, whether I'd show her some of the old family photographs too sometime, the ones from Mark's childhood, and I told her of course, that I'd been hoping she'd ask for years, that the whole point of family history was that it kept growing to include whoever chose to actually reach for it. She made a version of it herself the following week for Mark's actual birthday, imperfect, slightly overbaked on one side, the frosting a little thinner than mine usually turns out, and Lily, watching her mother present it nervously to the family, clapped and told her it looked perfect, a small, generous kindness from a 7-year-old that undid me more than almost anything else in this entire difficult season. Mark, cutting the first slice, told Vanessa quietly that it tasted exactly like his childhood, and I watched something in Vanessa's shoulders finally loosen, watching my son's wife taste 9 years of feeling like an outsider dissolve, at least for that one evening, into something that finally felt like belonging rather than performance. I don't know yet whether 9 years of quiet distance dissolve easily or whether Vanessa and I are simply building something new and more honest on top of what came before, but I know the cake gets made now with all of us in that kitchen together, flour in everyone's hair instead of just the children's, and that feels, after everything, like exactly the right way forward.